What if your daily meal came crawling with maggots? What if dinner smelled like bleach and rotten meat, but you had no choice but to eat it? Across America's deadliest prisons, mealtime isn't nourishment, it's punishment. This documentary exposes the horrifying truth about what inmates really eat behind bars, and the billion-dollar system feeding them filth. Before we begin, if you believe every human deserves dignity even in prison, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories the system doesn't want you to see. In 2013, the Michigan Department of Corrections made a decision that would change the lives and stomachs of more than 43,000 inmates across the state. They privatized their entire prison food system, handing control to a corporation named Aramark Correctional Services, a company already known for serving meals in schools, stadiums, and corporate cafeterias. On paper, the deal saved Michigan millions. In reality, it opened the door to one of the most disturbing food scandals in U.S. prison history. Within months, reports began pouring in. Inmates in facilities like Chippewa Correctional Facility and Kinross Prison started complaining of spoiled meat, moldy bread, and watered-down soup so thin you could see the bottom of the tray. Prisoners told investigators they were being served green hot dogs and meat that smelled like death. The state initially dismissed these claims as exaggerations, until corrections officers themselves began filing complaints. One officer anonymously told the Detroit Free Press, "The stench from the kitchen was unbearable. You could tell that meat had been sitting in the heat for days." Inmates said they were often so hungry that they ate around the rot, scraping mold off their bread just to get calories in their system. Soon after, a state inspection uncovered the shocking truth: food infested with maggots. Maggots were found in the serving area at Parnell Correctional Facility. Inmates claimed the infestation had been ignored for weeks. One recalled seeing worms wriggling on the mashed potatoes as a kitchen worker shouted, "Just rinse it off and serve it." The scandal didn't stop there. Reports showed that Aramark employees had been caught smuggling in contraband, engaging in sexual acts with inmates, and walking off the job mid-shift, leaving prisoners unfed for hours. Hundreds of Aramark workers were banned from prisons after repeated violations. Yet, despite public outrage, the state renewed its contract, because, as officials quietly admitted, it's cheaper than cooking our own food. By 2015, the Michigan Corrections Organization reported over 200 health violations linked to Aramark operations. Rotten chicken, expired milk, and cross-contaminated food were common. But perhaps the most haunting detail came from a whistleblower cook who told local journalists, "We were told to scrape mold off cheese, wash it, and serve it again. If we threw it away, we'd be fired for waste." This wasn't just bad food, it was systemic neglect, powered by profit. And Michigan wasn't alone. Across the country, states like Texas, Ohio, Arizona, and Florida were following the same privatization model, outsourcing inmate meals to for-profit corporations. The pattern repeated: cost-cutting, spoiled food, malnutrition, and rising tensions inside already volatile prisons. In Texas, inmates described eating slop so greasy it made people sick. Some said they found rat droppings in their rice. Others, pieces of metal and plastic. Prisoners began losing significant weight, some up to 20 pounds in a few months. In Arizona, under the same contractor, inmates complained of being served milk weeks past its expiration date and vegetables that were black with decay. A Department of Corrections report confirmed unsanitary conditions, but said no health emergencies were reported. A bureaucratic way of saying, no one died, so nothing changed. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was an epidemic, a hidden hunger crisis thriving inside America's prisons, where 1 in every 5 inmates reported skipping meals out of fear of contamination. The irony? The 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Yet, depriving people of safe, edible food has quietly become one of the cruelest punishments imaginable. But what happens to a person when they're starved, not just of nutrition, but of dignity? When food itself becomes a weapon of control. Every prison has a rhythm: the clang of metal doors, the echo of boots on concrete, the mechanical count of time. But inside the kitchen, that rhythm changes. It's faster, hotter, and dirtier. Here, behind steel doors and steam vents, the real face of prison food begins to show. In nearly every state-run facility, inmates are the backbone of kitchen labor. They peel, stir, scrub, and serve thousands of meals a day for pennies, often less than 30 cents an hour. On paper, it's a job meant to teach discipline and responsibility. In reality, it's a battlefield of spoiled ingredients, dangerous conditions, and moral decay. One former inmate from Ohio's Marion Correctional Institution, who later testified before a prison reform panel, recalled his first day in the kitchen vividly. "The smell hit me first: rotten onions, sour milk, grease that hadn't been changed in months. I was told to scrape mold off loaves of bread, then bag them for the next meal." He wasn't exaggerating. Official reports confirmed that in 2015, inspectors found mold, pests, and improper food storage in multiple Ohio kitchens managed by Aramark. The findings included maggots crawling under serving counters, boxes of expired food products stacked beside leaking pipes, and meat thawing in sinks filled with dirty water. For inmates working there, complaining wasn't an option. Those who spoke up risked losing their kitchen job, and with it their only source of income or extra food. One man in Arizona State Prison Complex, Amon, said, "You either keep quiet or go hungry. We'd eat whatever scraps were left after the officers and staff got their share." Behind the steaming vats of instant potatoes and reheated beans, everything was about cutting corners. Prison contractors saved money by substituting real ingredients with soy filler, powdered eggs, and recycled leftovers. Leftover chicken from lunch became casserole for dinner. Mystery meat was minced, spiced, and renamed beef stew. And anything past its expiration date was simply boiled longer. In Texas, the situation turned dire during the summers. With temperatures in some kitchens topping 120 degrees Fahrenheit, refrigerators struggled to stay cold. Milk curdled before it could be served. One Texas inmate described pouring milk that came out chunky like yogurt. Still, it was served to hundreds. For the cooks, survival meant adaptation. Inmates began creating prison hacks, ways to make food less dangerous. Some secretly sprinkled salt on spoiled meat, hoping to kill the smell. Others layered peanut butter on bread to hide mold stains. But the psychological toll was harder to mask. "You stop feeling human after a while," one cook said. "You're feeding people things you wouldn't give a dog. But if you don't, you get written up for insubordination." The danger wasn't limited to disgust. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, documented several outbreaks of foodborne illness linked to prison kitchens. In 2012, more than 250 inmates in Illinois fell violently ill after eating contaminated chicken salad. In Georgia, a similar outbreak left dozens hospitalized. Investigations often stopped short of punishment, because accountability blurred between state oversight and corporate contractors. Even worse, prisons used food as a weapon of control. Inmates who broke rules were placed on a diet known as Nutriloaf, a dense, flavorless brick made from blended leftovers. Officially, it met nutritional standards. In practice, it was a form of punishment condemned by human rights groups. Several lawsuits challenged its use, arguing that forcing prisoners to eat Nutriloaf violated the Eighth Amendment. In 2016, Vermont and Oregon finally banned it, but other states quietly continued the practice under new names like disciplinary loaf. Some inmates resorted to hunger strikes. In Michigan, prisoners refused meals for days, demanding real food. But as one protester said, "They don't care if you eat or not. Starving inmates save them money." Even officers began to notice the unrest. A Michigan corrections sergeant told reporters, "I've seen riots start over less. When you feed grown men spoiled food, you're sitting on a powder keg." And indeed, food-related protests have ignited violence across U.S. prisons. From Florida's Operation Push in 2018, where inmates refused to work or eat, to smaller hunger strikes in California's Pelican Bay State Prison, demanding edible meals and fair treatment. Yet, despite years of reports, lawsuits, and media investigations, the system barely changed. Why? Because feeding inmates poorly is profitable. The cheaper the meal, the bigger the margin. The state saves, the contractor profits, and the inmate suffers. The result is a moral paradox. America, a nation that prides itself on justice, has built a food system inside its prisons that mirrors the very cruelty it condemns abroad. Inside America's most dangerous prisons, food is never just food. It's currency, leverage, and sometimes, life itself. When you strip people of money, freedom, and choice, survival instincts kick in. Meals become the foundation of a new economy. An extra apple can buy loyalty. A sealed bag of instant noodles can secure protection. A single packet of coffee can spark violence. And behind the concrete walls of prisons like Angola, San Quentin, and Rikers Island, this underground trade thrives in the shadows. After the privatization wave slashed food portions and quality, inmates began relying heavily on the commissary system, the only place they could buy packaged food with money from family or prison jobs. But commissary items were marked up by as much as 300%, meaning a simple ramen pack that costs 30 cents outside could cost nearly $1 inside. For inmates earning less than 20 cents an hour, that meant weeks of labor for a single meal that wouldn't make them sick. Ramen noodles in particular became the gold standard. Sociologists studying prison economies even dubbed them the new cigarette. In Texas, one inmate explained it best: "You can trade ramen for anything: tattoos, protection, favors. Hunger made it the new dollar." In California's Pelican Bay State Prison, prisoners developed intricate barter systems. A bag of chips might buy a haircut. A spoonful of peanut butter could pay for a letter written to a loved one. But the darker side of this economy was how gangs and corrupt officers began to exploit it. Gangs quickly learned that whoever controlled food controlled power. In the Security Housing Units, SHU, of Pelican Bay, members of the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, and Mexican Mafia used food to enforce loyalty. A new inmate would be tested by being denied food, or offered some only to owe a favor later. That favor could be anything: smuggling, fighting, or silence. At Rikers Island, where chaos was routine, food trades often turned violent. Officers caught prisoners taxing weaker inmates for their trays. Others reported organized rackets, where prisoners on kitchen duty stole extra supplies and sold them cell to cell. "It's a black market," one former officer admitted. "You'd be shocked how much power a slice of bread can have in here." Corruption from staff made things worse. Some correctional officers accepted bribes to smuggle in real food, burgers, chips, candy, while others used the deprivation itself as control. One inmate from Louisiana's Angola prison recalled, "The guards would wave their own food in our faces. You could smell fried chicken down the tier while we ate something that looked like glue." As malnutrition spread, inmates adapted by turning contraband and creativity into prison cuisine. Using hot water, scavenged butter, and seasoning from ramen packets, they built entire meals known as spreads. These communal dishes, part rebellion, part survival, often brought inmates together for brief moments of humanity. A typical spread might include crushed chips, cheese powder, summer sausage, and noodles, all mixed in a trash bag and sealed to cook under a blanket for heat. A former inmate from Illinois' Stateville Correctional Center described it as Thanksgiving in a bag. He said, "It wasn't about taste. It was about control, choosing what you eat even if it's trash instead of being forced to swallow theirs." Psychologists who've studied prison life note that these underground meals carry deep emotional meaning. They represent autonomy, the one act an inmate can still control in a world designed to strip away every choice. But the hunger crisis also has deadly consequences. In some facilities, inmates with medical conditions, like diabetes or food allergies, were denied proper meals. In 2019, a diabetic inmate in Alabama reportedly collapsed and died after repeated denials of his special diet request. Lawsuits have piled up, but few result in lasting change. Meanwhile, the corporations behind prison food continue to profit. Aramark, Trinity Services Group, and others hold contracts worth hundreds of millions annually. Their parent companies report steady earnings, even as reports of contamination, malnutrition, and riots mount. Behind closed doors, it's an equation written in cruelty: the less it costs to feed a prisoner, the more money there is to make. Yet, amid all this, a quiet resistance grows. Whistleblowers, reform advocates, and journalists continue to expose the rot beneath the stainless steel counters. Each revelation, from maggots in Michigan to moldy bread in Florida, challenges the illusion that America's prisons are merely correctional. They're reflections of how the system values life, or doesn't. By the mid-2010s, the stench of rot inside America's prison kitchens could no longer be ignored. Maggots in food trays, moldy bread, and malnourished inmates had become more than rumor, they were evidence. And in courtrooms across the nation, that evidence was finally being laid bare. It began in Michigan, where the Detroit Free Press's year-long investigation into Aramark Correctional Services exposed a flood of internal emails, photos, and whistleblower testimonies. Kitchen staff described food labeled, "not for human consumption," being cooked for inmates. One memo showed a supervisor warning that chicken smelled off, but was ordered to serve it anyway, after boiling longer. The revelation sparked public outrage, but behind closed doors, state officials tried to contain the damage. According to released communications, Michigan's Department of Corrections quietly fined Aramark $200,000 for violations, only to cancel the fine days later after political pressure. When reporters asked why, a spokesperson replied, "We have confidence the issues are being resolved internally." But they weren't. In 2015, the state finally ended Aramark's contract, only to hand it to another private vendor, Trinity Services Group, whose record was nearly identical. Whistleblowers soon followed the paper trail. One former Trinity employee confessed to the Lansing State Journal that workers were ordered to stretch meat portions by mixing spoiled hamburger with beans. Another said supervisors threatened to fire staff who reported infestations. "We had rats running over bread trays," she testified. "When we called maintenance, they said to just cover it up." In Ohio, inmates filed a class action lawsuit after dozens suffered food poisoning from contaminated turkey and unwashed produce. The Ohio Inspector General's report confirmed widespread unsanitary practices, including mold, vermin, and falsified safety logs. Yet the state renewed Aramark's contract for another year. The story was the same in Florida, where prisoners alleged they were served meat-labeled pet food from suppliers. A public records request later revealed that the Florida Department of Corrections had received over 2,000 grievances about food between 2015 and 2018, but dismissed nearly all without investigation. Even federal facilities weren't immune. At USP Atlanta, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution uncovered internal audits describing rancid food storage conditions, while at FCIL Reno in Oklahoma, the U.S. Department of Justice received dozens of complaints about maggots in rice and beans. But perhaps the most explosive testimony came from inside the system itself. In 2017, Jamie Budnick, a kitchen supervisor at a Michigan prison, became one of the first employees to publicly testify against her employer. She described being forced to serve meals she wouldn't feed her own dog. "We found maggots and they told us to bleach the area and keep serving," she said before a state committee. "When I refused, they wrote me up for insubordination." Her bravery made headlines and cost her her job. Across the country, other insiders began leaking photos and documents. Images of worm-infested mashed potatoes, discolored meat, and trays smeared with mold started circulating online. They were impossible to deny. The corporations responded with PR statements blaming isolated incidents and rogue employees. Yet records told another story. Aramark and Trinity had collectively been fined over $3 million in penalties across multiple states for violations related to food quality, staffing, and sanitation. Still, reform was glacial. Contracts were renewed quietly, often under political donors' influence. In some cases, former state officials who oversaw the contracts later took jobs with those same corporations. A revolving door that ensured accountability stayed out of reach. Meanwhile, prisoners continued to file grievances. One inmate's letter from Arizona State Prison Complex, Lewis read, "We eat slop that smells like sewage. I've been sick 3 times this month. Nobody cares. They say, you're lucky to eat it all." Such words echoed across the system, proof that hunger had become a silent form of punishment. In 2018, the Marshall Project and The Guardian launched a joint investigation, uncovering how food complaints were often deliberately suppressed. In some states, grievance forms about food were rerouted to the same contractors being accused, letting them decide if their own behavior violated standards. The lawsuits piled up, but change rarely followed. Even when courts sided with inmates, settlements were small and reforms unenforced. In 2021, an Illinois prisoner won a $12,000 settlement after proving he was repeatedly served moldy bread and undercooked meat, a fraction of what any restaurant would pay for the same negligence. But the most chilling fact remained: no one could escape eating. Hunger was both unavoidable and unprofitable to fix. By the end of the decade, human rights organizations like Amnesty International and the ACLU's National Prison Project began labeling U.S. prison food conditions a humanitarian crisis. They cited violations of international standards, including the United Nations Mandela Rules, which require all prisoners be given nutritious, safe food. Still, inside the walls, most inmates saw no difference. The same trays, the same smells, the same feeling that their lives, and their meals, were disposable. But amid the despair, a small group of reformers began to push back: activists, former inmates, journalists, and families who refused to stay silent. Their movement would change how America viewed food behind bars, and challenge one of the most profitable, least accountable industries in the nation. By the late 2010s, the silence surrounding America's prison food crisis began to crack. It didn't happen in Washington or inside corporate boardrooms. It started with people who refused to look away. Former inmates, prison workers, and families of the incarcerated began joining forces, transforming their outrage into organized resistance. One of the earliest reform sparks came from former Michigan inmate Kevin Campbell, who began documenting everything he saw: mold-covered bread, green-colored meat, and boxes labeled "Do Not Serve." When he was released in 2017, he published his photos online under the hashtag #FoodBehindBars, sparking a viral conversation. His posts were raw, graphic, and impossible to ignore. News outlets picked them up, and soon lawmakers were forced to respond. That same year, a coalition of advocacy groups, including the ACLU National Prison Project, the Marshall Project, and Nation Inside, launched investigations and public campaigns demanding food reform in prisons. Their reports painted a disturbing picture. Nearly 60% of U.S. states had documented cases of food contamination or malnutrition in correctional facilities between 2010 and 2020. Families joined the fight too. Mothers began organizing under movements like End Prison Hunger and Families for Justice Reform. They shared stories of loved ones falling sick or losing dangerous amounts of weight behind bars. One mother from Texas tearfully recounted to reporters how her son, a nonviolent offender, wrote her letters saying, "Mom, I'm hungry all the time. The food smells like garbage. I can't take it anymore." Her words became the human face of the hidden hunger crisis. In Florida, a group of formerly incarcerated chefs created a nonprofit called Feed Them with Dignity, advocating for transparency in prison food contracts. They pushed for states to publish what they paid contractors, where food was sourced, and how quality was verified. "Taxpayers deserve to know," one of the founders said. "If we're paying for poison, we all share the blame." Even within the system, reform was brewing. Some corrections officers, disgusted by what they witnessed, became quiet allies. At a 2019 prison reform forum in Ohio, an officer admitted, "We can't expect inmates to respect authority when we feed them garbage. Starving men make dangerous men." Journalists continued to shine a light on the issue. The Marshall Project, Vice News, and the New York Times ran exposés tracing the massive profits of food service giants like Aramark and Trinity, companies with combined revenues exceeding $40 billion globally. Their findings revealed a pattern of neglect protected by bureaucracy and profit. Pressure mounted. In 2020, under mounting public scrutiny, Michigan and Ohio began re-evaluating their prison food contracts. For the first time in years, state-run kitchens were reinstated in select facilities. Early reports showed improved sanitation and morale, but scaling the change nationwide would take years. Meanwhile, reformers proposed stronger oversight measures: independent inspections, public reporting, and banning private food contracts entirely. The idea was simple but revolutionary: return food service to state control with public accountability instead of private secrecy. Documentaries and social media helped amplify the cause. Viral exposés like Meals Behind Bars and Feeding the Forgotten drew millions of views, putting faces to the suffering. For the first time, ordinary citizens saw that food deprivation wasn't just a prison issue, it was a human rights issue. By 2023, some victories emerged. States like California, Oregon, and Minnesota adopted new standards requiring local sourcing, nutrition benchmarks, and random kitchen audits. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Former inmates became advocates. Some started YouTube channels and podcasts, telling their stories unfiltered. Others testified in front of state legislatures, demanding humane food standards and an end to disciplinary starvation. Their voices, once silenced by concrete and steel, were now echoing across the country. And perhaps most importantly, the public began to understand the truth, that justice doesn't end at conviction. A sentence to prison isn't a sentence to starvation. America's prison food system remains a battlefront between profit and humanity. But every whistleblower, every family, every reformer who stands up chips away at a wall of silence that stood for decades. The fight isn't over, but for the first time, it's being fought in the open. Behind every tray of rotten food lies a bigger story, of neglect, greed, and dehumanization. What happens in these kitchens says more about our justice system than any courtroom ever could. Because how a nation feeds its prisoners reveals how it values human life. If this story opened your eyes, don't look away now. Hit the like button, subscribe for more real prison documentaries, and share this video so the truth keeps spreading. This is Behind Bars TV, where we expose what the world hides. Until next time, remember, justice isn't just about punishment, it's about dignity.